Well, happy Thursday, everybody. Pastor Steve here. As always, I'm grateful you've joined me for today's devotion, whether you're listening to the podcast or watching the video. Today, we are in the first chapter of Titus, and I love the book of Titus as well as 1st and 2nd Timothy. These are my favorite epistles, in part because Paul wrote them to these two young preachers, Titus and Timothy, and gave them a lot of instructions. And when I was a young minister, I would read these a lot. And I still like to read them and be reminded of what it means to be a minister, a pastor, a preacher, and so on. And so these are favorite books of mine, and I could talk a lot about each of these letters. Let me say that Paul left in chapter 1. He tells us that he had left Titus on the island of Crete to appoint the preachers, pastors of the different churches on that island. When you read in the book of Acts about Paul's 3 missionary journeys and then his trip as a prisoner to Rome, of course, the book of Acts ends with Paul under house arrest in Rome and does not tell us what happened to him after that. But this indicates in Titus 1 that Paul had traveled to Crete and done evangelistic work, church planting, and left Titus there to finish the work and appoint the pastors. Well, there's no record in Acts of Paul visiting Crete, which is an island in the Mediterranean, other than on that journey after he had finished all 3 missionary journeys and he was arrested in Jerusalem and over a period of a few years shipped to Rome for trial. The ship that he was on briefly docked on the island of Crete and then continued on their journey in the Mediterranean Sea, and as you'll recall, were caught in a storm. So I think Paul was released from prison in Rome, and a lot of scholars would agree with that, and continued his ministry for a few years before he was arrested again and ultimately executed as a martyr by the Romans. And Crete is one of the places he went. And so this was written after he was released from Roman prison in Acts 28. The book of Romans tells us Paul had a desire to go to Spain. I don't think he ever did. I think he continued ministering in Greece and Crete and that part of the world. Actually, 2 Timothy, which may be the last book Paul ever wrote, tells us that later, after this event, Paul sent Titus to Dalmatia, which is modern Croatia. So that tells us more about where Paul was ministering after his release from house arrest. So that's just some biblical tidbit for you. Paul, in chapter 1, uses some words to describe himself and his own ministry. He gives Titus some instructions for how to act as a young preacher, but he also lists in chapter 1 qualifications Titus was to pay attention to as he appointed pastors, elders, overseers, preachers in these churches on the island of Crete. And as a minister, those things always speak to me. And so it's from that perspective I want to share with you some thoughts. In verse 1, Paul refers to himself as a bondservant of God. I think the NIV translates it just as servant. The word is doulos, which is the word for slave. And it's interesting because in the New Testament, the word slave is used for us as disciples, but it's used with a sense of dignity because we voluntarily choose to submit ourselves to the lordship and ownership of Jesus. The word doulos means a slave who has no claim to owning himself or herself. And we are a slave in the sense that we come to Jesus and say, Lord, you have all of me. I own none of me. I own nothing in my life. And that's why we say from time to time that tithing, giving 10% of our income to the Lord's work through the local church, is a way of recognizing and owning God's ownership. And it's not that God only owns the 10%, He owns 100%, meaning that God owns what you do with the other 90% as well. That we have the attitude of, we don't own anything. As a minister, if God calls me to ministry, He owns me. God is the one who tells me where to go. I have a problem with young people who go into ministry, but they only want to serve Jesus here. And it's not new. When I was in seminary, I'd have young preachers say, yeah, I'm going to go back to Alabama. I'm going to go back to Mississippi. I'm going to go back to South Carolina. And I'm saying, well, so God doesn't have a say in it? And in recent years, as Steve Polk and I have done searches for staff members, we've identified some talented people who just don't want to leave the Greenville area. They go to school at Anderson. They go to school at North Greenville, and they fall in love with that area. And they're going to serve Jesus, but only there. And I'm thinking, do you know what it means to be a doulos? A bondservant of God, a slave of Jesus. You go where He tells you to go. And preachers who aren't willing to do that, I just have some questions about their absolute surrender to Jesus. Serving Jesus with conditions. Jesus, I'll serve you if I get to be in control of a little bit of it. Anyway, that's just some personal thoughts. The other thing he says about himself in verse 1, Paul, the bondservant or doulos, slave and apostle of Jesus Christ, for the faith of those chosen of God and the knowledge of the truth, which is according to godliness. We get great joy out of serving. I do. I get fulfillment out of serving, and anyone who serves faithfully does. But we need to bear in mind that the reason God calls us to serve, and if God calls you to ministry, it's not for your sake, it's for the sake of those you will serve. He says in verse 1, for the faith of those. I'm responsible for the impact I have on the faith of other people. Anyone in ministry is, and our calling is not to be happy, not to be fulfilled, even though serving Jesus, there's happiness in it. Serving Jesus, there's fulfillment in it. We serve Jesus for the sake of those we serve, for the faith, to build up their faith, to see that those who are lost come to faith. It's about others. Too many people in ministry make it about self. And again, I would say they don't understand what it means to be a doulos to Jesus Christ. Well, preacher, you've said enough about it. Okay. He gives some very high qualifications there in verses 6 and following. And in verse 9 talks about the word. Holding fast the faithful word. Some Bibles will translate it, holding fast the trustworthy word. In other words, God's word is trustworthy, reliable, faithful to who God is, and faithful to what God thinks, faithful to what God feels, faithful to what God says. It's trustworthy, it's reliable, it's dependable. And he says, we who preach and teach are to take His word and do two things, exhort and refute. Exhort means to encourage, to build up, to strengthen. Refute, correct error, correct what is wrong. He goes on in verse 11 saying that those who teach things that are wrong are to be silenced. And one of the great responsibilities I have is to make certain false teaching doesn't occur. Whether it comes from someone who comes to speak or it comes from the laity. Because God's word doesn't change, no matter how much people try to corrupt it. So anyway, I don't know if that means much to you. I'm sharing there because I'm a preacher and these verses always speak to me as a preacher. And so those are some of my thoughts. Hope you found something in that blessed you or helped you in a little way. I'll see you tomorrow as we look at chapter 2. And he talks about the responsibilities of those who are old and young and others in the church. So we'll see you then.